Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So we were waiting for the main speaker, Ms. Boyoung Lee, and I will quickly introduce our speakers and discussion. Firstly, I am Chris Park from Aon Hewitt's Korea operation. I am Managing Director of Aon Hewitt in Korea. As you might notice, Aon Hewitt is a combined consulting organization from Aon Consulting and Hewitt Associates. And you can find Aon's logo from Park Ji-sung's uniform in Manchester United. And now Aon Hewitt is world #1, the largest HR consulting firm in the world. Ms. Boyoung Lee, her name in English is Judy, so you can find Boyoung and Judy in the material. Boyoung is practice leader of global diversity and inclusion of Aon Hewitt. We call it Emerging Workforce Solutions Practice, and she's based in New York City. She has over 13 years of diversity and inclusion experiences, both internally and externally as a consultant. Prior to joining Aon Hewitt, Boyoung has experience of diversity leadership role with Ernst Young, and also she was director of advisory services with Catalyst. And I'd like to introduce two honorable discussants. The gentleman is Nicholas Oviz, CEO of NHCA Asset Management. Nicholas is a CEO of NHCA, the joint venture between 농협 and Amundi, which is previously Credit Agricole Asset Management since 2007. Prior to this role, he was director and head of business development for Asia ex-Japan at Credit Agricole Asset Management Hong Kong. He has been with Amundi since 1990, firstly in Paris, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. And Ms. Francie Fallon, the CHO from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you. Francie is responsible for providing the vital link between the foundation's diverse and talented staff and the leadership team. Prior to joining the foundation, Fallon served as Vice President of Human Resources at Pioneer Hybrid International and DuPont Company. And I'd like to ask Boyoung to start her main speaking in why the next generation will challenge the workplace like no other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I do apologize for running a bit late. I am unfortunately pregnant, and so eating lunch for me was a bit of a priority. So today we're going to cover the topic of generational diversity in the workplace and how it impacts employers. And I want to thank the organizers of the Global HR Forum for inviting me and having this session, because it's such a great topic and it's such a fun topic to talk about, and it's something that is impacting all employers around the world. So just to get started, one quote that I always like to start off with is from Peter Drucker. And Peter Drucker said, "The dominant factor for business in the next 2 generations is not going to be economics or technology, it will be demographics." Basically saying, I think for a long time, the starting session yesterday, one of the panelists had talked about how, we don't oftentimes focus enough on the people element and the impact of people and the development of people when we make business decisions. And Peter Drucker, being one of the godfathers of diversity of management, has really said for the next few decades, focus on the people, because that's going to be the most important element of your business success. So while we're going to focus on generational diversity in the workplace, I just wanted to highlight a few of what we call the demographic tsunami that's going to be impacting and creating huge challenges for organizations going forward. And some of those trends that we're seeing in the workplace, we're seeing an aging population. I don't think I really have to explain this one for the Korean audience. You're aware of the aging population, and it's something that not only Korea is dealing with, but basically most developed nations, most of Western Europe, Japan as well, they're really seeing huge aging populations, which puts a lot of pressure and creates a labor shortage in most developed countries. We're also seeing unprecedented levels of immigration. Again, Korea is seeing, I think there's this misnomer that Korea is a fairly homogenous country, but as a lot of you know, there's been huge immigration from Southeast Asia, which is putting, adding a new dimension of diversity to the Korean workforce. And then we're seeing immigration around the world. So, there are Filipinos in Saudi Arabia, Western Europeans in America, Africans in Latin America, which, really are creating just an unprecedented level of diversity in every country around the world. We're seeing higher birth rates in developing nations. So while developed nations like Korea, Japan, Western Europe are seeing lower rates of birth, we're seeing population booms in places like India, in the Middle East, in South America, and also in Africa. And one way to think about it is to say, the median age in places like Japan, Korea, Western Europe, and most of America is somewhere in the late 30s to the early 40s. In countries like India, the median age is in the late teens. I think it's about 17 or 18 in India. So think about that difference, and think about economic competitiveness over the next couple of decades and what it means to have a 40-year-old workforce versus a 17-year-old workforce. We're seeing unprecedented levels of globalization. We have a saying in the U.S., and it says, go west for opportunity. But that saying has been updated recently. It says, go west and don't stop until you get to Asia, because that's where the opportunity is. You're seeing unprecedented levels of just a very mobile workforce and a very virtual workforce. I'm sure many of you have been in this situation where you're on a phone call and you have representatives from Europe, from across Asia and North America and South America, and it's probably 5 a.m. in the morning, so that all of you can talk on the phone at the same time. And then finally, we're seeing just an unprecedented level of women in the labor force. Korea is, has seen a huge influx of women entering into the workplace. The U.S. is seeing this as well. In the last couple of years, because of the global recession, the women are now the majority of the workforce in the U.S., and we're seeing this across the globe. And this puts a lot of pressure on the traditional ways that we work, because of, women do work differently. There are different cultures around, female norms around leadership. And also, with the balance of work and life, that's putting a lot of pressure on the traditional ways of work. So these are just some of the trends that I wanted to present to provide you a context within which we talk about generational diversity. So, as you think about working with the millennials, those new kids who are entering into the workforce, those 20-year-olds who are entering into the workforce, how many of us have thought of one or more of these, or come up with one or more of these comments when we work with these millennials and the frustration they bring? We may think, well, are you getting your work done? You walk by their computers and they have 10 different screens up. They're probably listening to some music, and you're like, how in the world are they getting work done when they have an IM chat box, their email, 2 documents open, music playing? Are you getting your work done? We may think, you want to be CEO by when? We think, they have these expectations of what they're able to accomplish and when they want to accomplish them, and they're not necessarily on our time frame. Where's your work ethic? I need you to focus. Why can't you focus? We may have all thought of that as well. You call that quality, they turn in a report, maybe a draft report, and you look at it and you go, what were you thinking? How can you possibly think that this is something you can turn into me? And you want to work from where? You mean you want to go down to the cafe to work? No, you work at your desk. You work at your desk and only at your desk and only during the hours that we tell you to work. Leave at 2 p.m. and log back in at 2 a.m.? Are you crazy? Why would you want to do that? How are you going to get your work done? How do I know that you're getting your work done if you're going to leave at 2 and then log back in at 2 a.m.? So how many of us have had this thought at one point or another when we've worked with millennials? Probably all of us, unless we're a millennial. I'm not. Unless you're a millennial, you've probably had this thought about one of your younger colleagues. And all of this is to present the fact that we're just really not ready for the next generation and for the challenges that they bring in. So let's take a look at the 4 generations in the workplace. I apologize, the font on this is very small. But basically right now in the workplace, we have 4 generations, and we're seeing this on a fairly consistent basis on a global. The oldest generation is what we call the traditionalists, and they're the ones who were born prior to World War II. So they're the ones who, lived through World War II, and they're quite old now. They're usually past the age of 65. We're seeing baby boomers entering into baby boomers. They're the majority of the senior management at this point. This is the post-World War II generation. They're the ones who built up the nations after, the Great War. We're seeing Generation X, which, are people who are mostly in their mid-30s to early 40s. This is the smallest generation that we're seeing. And then finally, of course, the millennials, who are mostly born post-1980, born during a revolutionary time in technology. And let's take a look at the generation as it breaks down in Korea itself. So here are just a few numbers. I'm not going to go into them in depth. But one thing I do really want to point out is the fact that the generation millennials, and I know in Korea they call them Generation N and Generation I. In North America we call them Generation Y as well, but we'll call them millennials just for ease. You'll notice here actually that there's kind of an interesting trend, and we again see this globally. We see that there's a fairly large number of baby boomers in the workforce, and this is global. And then we see a very, very small generation. Generation X is actually quite a small generation. Here in Korea, the disparity is not huge. It's about 2 million, just about 2 million less Generation X than baby boomers. But in North America and in some other countries, Generation X is literally half the size of baby boomers. And then we actually see millennials, and millennials are a large generation. And they're actually larger. In most countries, they're actually larger than the baby boomers. And that's actually one of the reasons why when you ask yourself, well, why are we so concerned about the millennials? We weren't that concerned with Gen X. Well, I say, well, Gen X was pretty small. And Gen X was forced, because of their size, to adapt to the baby boomers in front of them. So they said, we can't really fight the norms that you baby boomers have put out there, so we'll adapt to them. The millennials are saying, no, we're large, we're different, and we know that. So we're going to behave differently. And that's one of the reasons why there's been so much focus on the millennials, and also so much kind of stress about what they're going to do to the workplace. So this is just, a little bit of, a focus on them. And I also just wanted you to pay attention that we're afraid of the millennials now. We're like, oh my gosh, they're really different. And just know that we're seeing the first wave of them coming. We got 15 more years of millennials coming. So they're not going away. So you can't just kind of say, oh, well, we'll deal with them in a few years. They're going to be coming for the next 15 years, and they're quite different. So let's think about how we actually think about generations. Most people like to think about generations chronologically, so they like to think about it as age. If you're between this age and this age, you're a millennial. If you're between 35 and 45, you're a Gen X. But what we actually like to say at Aon Hewitt is that experiences shape generations. It's the experiences that you grew up with as a child that shape the behaviors and norms and values that define your generation. So let's take a look at some of those experiences and see how they actually shape the generations. Let's take a look at some of the economic and political trends that existed when each of these generations entered the workplace and they were growing up. For baby boomers, it's post-war. There was a lot of rebuilding, a lot of sacrifice, but also a lot of creation and expansion. You basically had, after the war, in almost every country in the world, a clean slate to start rebuilding. And the baby boomers took that mission and ran with it. And they basically got to define the new modern age. And that shaped their worldview. The Generation X, they entered the workplace and they grew up during a time of the emergence of the Asian tiger. but they also grew up in a time during the monetary crisis, a lot of instability, economic contraction, and then also the emergence of democracy and quite a bit of chaos during that emergence of democracy. That is what shapes their generation. And then the millennials, they grew up during a time of unprecedented globalization, modernization, technology boom. Korea became a creditor nation during their childhood and during their youth. And then also they grew up during some uncertainty. And one thing to think about is this shapes our worldview and how we view the world. Boomers, they grew up during a time of creation. They think the world is about creation and about opportunity. Gen X, they grew up during a time of contraction. Someone asked me the other day, why exactly is Gen X called Generation X? And it comes from the fact that the generation was considered a fairly nihilistic generation, a fairly sarcastic, fairly depressed generation. So X, the letter X, which sometimes is used for poison, that's why we got named the Generation X. That's my generation. And then the millennials, they're called the millennials because they emerged during the change of the millennium. But they also grew up during unprecedented globalization and this expansion, this interconnectedness. So again, when you think about the millennials and think about the fact that they're quote unquote dreamers, well, why are they dreamers? Because look at the amount of change that took place during their lifetime. What do they do after school? How does that shape their life? Boomers. Well, first of all, boomers, you're lucky if you went to school at all. And then there was quite a bit of freedom as well. Because it was a period of time of unstructured, the systems were being built. So there's quite a bit of freedom. Generation X, for all of you, that pretty much it was all about study. You went to school and then you came home and then you studied till midnight. And then you woke up in the morning and you studied. And then you went to school and then you studied. And then you ask, well, why are they such a depressed generation? Well, that's because they were studying all the time. They didn't do anything else. And then the millennials, they spend their time on the internet. After school, it was internet. And probably also, at some point or another, they studied abroad or they wanted to study abroad. They know somebody who studied abroad. Again, this shapes our worldviews. This shapes our behaviors and norms. And so when you think about, the fact, why is one generation different from the other? These experiences shape who they are. And then let's think about how news was delivered. For boomers, it was primarily newspapers, also neighbors in your community, a very informal way of getting the news. For Generation X, it was primarily TV. And then for the millennials, it was primarily the internet, news feeds, blogs, smartphones. And think about the paradigm that each of these different news outlets, provide. Newspapers, they're very structured. Some editor in some room is sitting there telling you whatever's on the first page is the most important thing that you need to read. So you're like, okay, that's the most important thing that I need to understand. And then you go from there in levels of importance. You can't control how you read the newspaper, basically. It's a set, unmovable thing. Think about what the internet news feeds are. They are entirely adjustable to the needs and the desires of the user. So if you may say, fashion is the most important thing to me. And you know what? I can adjust the internet news feed to ensure that the first thing that comes up on my front page is the fashion news. And then I'll say, and then maybe it's going to be about local politics. So that's the second thing you see. Entirely adjustable to the needs of the user. And then we ask the question, well, why are the millennials so focused on their needs? Well, every paradigm that they've ever dealt with has been something that can be adjusted to their needs and their desires. So, of course, they enter the workplace and then they ask, well, why can't I change this to meet my needs? Everything else in the world is changeable to my needs. And this is one of the things that have shaped that behavior and that worldview. And then first experiences with computers. For most boomers, it was probably as an adult. And for a lot of boomers, as I can attest from my own parents, they're still not very comfortable with their computers. I know that there are quite a number of executives actually in the U.S. who have their secretaries print out their emails. They'll write their response on the piece of paper that the email is printed out on. They'll hand it back to their secretary. The secretary will type it up and send it out. And that's the way that they use their email. For Generation X, it was probably sometime in middle school that you encountered your first computer. I think I was about in 7th grade when I really first sat down in front of my first real computer and started playing with it. And then for the millennials, it was probably at the age of 2 or 3, or maybe even younger. At this point in time, basically it feels as though most children are born with like an iPod in their hand. They come out, and they just know how to play with it already. I see these little 2-year-olds just playing with their iPod better than I can. And you think about how most organizations deal with the philosophy that you deal with technology. Technology is something that is a privilege in most organizations. So the smallest laptop, the most portable laptop, the best smartphones, who do they go to? They go to the boomers. But who can really utilize those tools the best? Probably the millennials. Why, so you think about, does our technology philosophy and approach to technology actually make sense? We're giving the tools, the tools that will lead to the most productivity, surprise to the people who are least likely to be able to use them. And then you wonder why the millennials are always like harping and saying, can I have a smartphone? Can I have a BlackBerry? Well, that's the reason why. So then let's take a look at sort of how these experiences shape and have implications in the workplace. Well, it shapes, our experiences, our worldview shapes our view of work. So how many of you, if you're a boomer or you're Gen X or you're millennial, how many of you kind of see yourself reflected in one of these statements? For boomers, work is my life. Work is my life. The more I work, the more enriched my life is. I define my sense of identity by my work. That's the generation of the boomers, the ones who created basically the modern society after World War II. Work is my life. For Generation X, work gives me a life. I will work. I will make the sacrifices, but don't tell me that I'm defined by my job. My life is defined outside of work, but work facilitates the life that I want. And then the millennials say, I am way more than my job. I do it because obviously I need the money and I need to do things, but I am my dreams. I am my hopes and my aspirations. I am far more than that. And so we talk oftentimes in the workplace, we tell you work, we talk about jobs, we talk about all that means, and we presume that everybody in the room that we're talking to has the same understanding of work. But really, if you're a boomer and you're talking about work, you're basically talking about your life and your sense of self-identity. But that's not what the millennials believes. That's not what the Generation X believes. And then you walk away from a meeting and you kind of say, oh, they're so uncommitted. Well, that's because you have a very different perspective and a relationship to work. So let's take a look at what technology tells us a little bit more about our worldviews. Boomers. What was the primary technology that existed for boomers? Or one example of it. It was the assembly line. It was the factory. And what does an assembly line look like? It's a very predetermined process that allows for no creativity. Product enter, a little widget, a little nugget begins on one end of the assembly line. It goes down in a very orderly manner to the next, to the next, to the next. You add something to it, and finally at the end of the assembly line, you have a finished product. What does that sound like? That sounds like a very traditional career ladder. There are certain steps of a career. You climb it. You don't ask to jump ahead because that's not the way the assembly line is. The career path is designed. You go step by step by step, and eventually at the very end of it, you'll have a finished product or a finished career. Well, what about Xers? What is their model? What is one of their technology models? It's an Internet 1.0. 1.0 is very important. The Internet now is this very interactive, user-driven Internet. But Internet 1.0, if all of you can think back to the Internet when it first started in 1993, it was entirely one-way medium, and it was kind of a flawed medium. You could see the potential of it, but it was a very one-way directive technology, and it had its limitations. It was good for some things, but it wasn't good for others. So it was very kind of limited in its usage. And again, it kind of reinforced, our understanding of Generation X. They said, oh, things are okay, but we're a very cynical generation. We're like, things work, but there's limitations. Well, yeah, that's because Internet 1.0 is an example of what emerged during our generation again. And then for millennials, what kind of technology symbolizes them? iTunes, Facebook, MySpace. Entirely interactive, entirely malleable, entirely iterative. This is a generation of experimentation. because that's the model that they grew up with. You know, you go onto Facebook, you start your Facebook page. It's not going to be the first time you post your Facebook page, you know, after you sign up and 5 minutes later you're on Facebook. It's not a complete profile. It's, you know, it's your name and maybe a picture. And then you get feedback from other people, you make some updates to it, it gets a little bit more snazzy, people give you some more feedback, you connect with some friends, and eventually, like 2 weeks later, it's this great dynamic page. But it didn't start off that way, but it took about 2 weeks to build it, but it was a very iterative process. So then, you know, earlier I said, how many of you have asked that question? You call this quality work? Because you get something from a millennial and you're like, that can't be the final product, can it? Well, it's not, because they grew up in an iterative world. They believe that nothing is an end product, or, you know, things get designed through iterations. You know, say, I can do it on Facebook, I can do it, you know, in pretty much anything else. Why can't I do it for work? I'm not giving you this as an end product. I want your feedback so I can make it better. And the boomer is thinking, if this is what they're giving me, I can't trust this person. Well, wait a couple of weeks, give them some feedback and see what happens from there. And so even like when you are thinking about the generations, you know, I said we're going to focus primarily on the millennials, but actually I want to focus on all the generations. That's the surprise of this presentation, is when you want to think about a generation, it's not enough just to look at their behavior. You have to look one step beyond that and say, why does that behavior exist? And how is that behavior different from my own? We actually have when we talk about cross-cultural competence, which is that ability to work across differences in any form in the workplace, we actually have a 3-step model. I don't have a picture of it here, but we say, it starts off with, it's all about me. If we actually want to be able to work with someone who's different from ourselves, we actually have to first understand how we behave. Then we say it's all about them. Okay, let's understand the differences from the other perspective. And then finally we say it's all about us. How do we work together? So it's all about me, it's all about them, it's all about us. As opposed to starting with it's all about them. Tell me about them. So then let's take a look at some of the workforce and workplace implications. So your generation influences your relationship to work. I gave you a couple of quotes. Work is my life versus work gives me a life. It influences your relationship to work. It influences your favorite management style, whether you like command and control versus a much more collaborative way of working. It influences your attitudes towards authority. Do you push back against authority? Pretty much, here's a little hint about Generation X. Generation X doesn't like a lot of authority. We actually push against it. Boomers love authority. They thrive with authority and authority figures. Our generation impacts our sense of loyalty. It impacts what we value, and it impacts our norms. And these have direct implications to how we design work. So take, for example, something like our values. That will have a direct implication to our compensation model. Can we assume that everybody values the same things? We were having a conversation the other night, and someone pointed out to me that for boomers, for those people in senior leadership positions, they don't actually value monetary compensation as much as they value social markers of hierarchy, like having a driver and having a car service, having access to having your club dues paid so you can be a part of the exclusive clubs. That's what they value. For Generation X, that is probably in the prime of building a family, they value actually monetary compensation quite a bit, because that means that they can buy a home. That means that they can pay for college for their children, like their 10-year-old child that's going to go to college soon. So for them, they value that. And then for the millennials, their primary value is their own freedom and their own time. And so if we're trying to build a compensation model that works for everybody, and we assume that everybody values certain things in the same way, you're going to basically create a compensation model that fits one generation. So then the implication becomes, okay, if we know that there are all these differences between generations, what are we going to do from a job design place, an organizational job design? And basically, one of the things that we are seeing is we're seeing a movement towards greater flexibility in benefits, greater flexibility in job design, greater flexibility in the way that we work. And that, because of the great amount of diversity that is emerging, that is the trend of the workplace that we're seeing. Now, of course, one of the pressures of this, we do quite a bit of work at Aon Hewitt. We work with a large number of organizations that are globalizing. And as part of that globalization process, a lot of organizations are saying, well, we need to get standard processes in there. And, the question becomes, well, you're going to try to standardize processes, but what elements of culture, what elements of diversity are you going to eliminate as part of that standardization process? Ensure that you're not eliminating the most important as you go through that standardization process. Try to understand what is important, what is flexible. We actually use another model at Hewitt where we say, ask yourself whenever you're in the workplace, is it a tradition, a preference, or a requirement? Basically, a lot of times when we insist that certain things need to be the way they are in the workplace, ask yourself, is that a really requirement of the job? Is that a really requirement for a company? Or is that simply a tradition or a preference that I have that I would really want everybody else to do? But it's not really a requirement. Think about that when you think about, the next time you look at, a redesign or a job design or an organizational structure redesign. Is it a preference, a tradition, or an actual requirement? So one thing that, we always say at Aon Hewitt is we say it's not a one-way street. It's not that boomers have to adapt to millennials or millennials have to adapt to boomers or Generation X has to do X, Y, and Z. We actually say it is a two-way street. It is about mutual adaptation for everybody. So boomers have to be aware and make adaptations for the Generation X and the millennials. But it is as important for the millennials as well to say, I'm entering into a very diverse place. I have to make adaptations as well. And here are some of our shorthand for the adaptation. Again, I apologize. I realize the font is a little small for all of you. We say, well, when it comes to communication, what are some things you need to do? For baby boomers, show them respect and choose face-to-face communication if at all possible, because that's what they're most comfortable with. For the Generation X, it means about getting to the point, and it means about also balancing between email and face-to-face. And then finally, for the millennials, it's about orienting them quickly. There's been a lot of research that shows that millennials don't read. It's not that they don't read, but they're so accustomed to a shorthand way of reading. If you think about the way in which news is delivered over the internet, they need to be oriented very quickly. And also, they prefer email and IM. So never be afraid to send them something by email. It's not weird for them. What about development and job design? For baby boomers, it's about acknowledging accomplishments and gratitude, and it's also about advancement and title. Show them the hierarchy and show them where they fit within that hierarchy. They'll be grateful for that. For Generation X, because they're kind of a little bit more of a chaotic generation, give them space to explore and find the solutions. And also, they want to have a little bit more fun in the workplace, so lighten up. And then finally, for the millennials, they want feedback, they want constant feedback, and they want you to respond quickly. They want to be challenged, and they also want to know the big picture. It's not enough to just tell them, go and make these copies, go and do this. They want to know why they're making those copies. They want to know why they're being asked to perfect this PowerPoint. So to outline the end game for them. From a recruitment perspective, baby boomers, you're not so much recruiting baby boomers at this point, but it's a matter of retaining them, keeping their knowledge. So proactively come up with retention strategies for those baby boomers. For the Generation X, it's go through their social networks. And by social network, I don't mean the computer. I mean go through professional societies, go through social networks. Literally ask someone, if you're looking for a middle manager, ask another middle manager, do you have a friend or do you know somebody in your network that you think would be a perfect fit for this job? That's probably the best way to find them. And then for millennials, it's all about technology. They're happy technology is their medium for recruitment. And then finally, a retention strategy. For baby boomers, it's about highlighting their values and contributions to the company. It's about, it's being grateful for what they've contributed. For Generation X, it's about getting over the notion of dues paid. They actually, because right now most senior leadership positions are filled by baby boomers, for a lot of Generation X, they kind of look up and they say, there's no way that I'm going to be able to make it to that next level because there are so many boomers in front of me. Well, so show them how they're going to get to that next step. That's the clearest retention and best retention strategy for them. And then for millennials, and we all know, some people say, well, millennials aren't going to stay anyway, so why should we even bother trying to retain them? Well, there are ways of retaining them, but you just need to know what those are. And part of it is finding them a mentor. I think millennials, more than any generation, grew up during a time when parents were, the model of parenting changed. And parents became way more involved in the rearing of their children than in any generation before. So basically, millennials grew up during a time when, like, parents were always available, and if a parent wasn't available, there was a coach available. If a coach wasn't available, a teacher was available. They grew up during a time with a model of being mentored. And they expect that in the workplace. So find them a mentor, set up a mentoring program for them. They will actually utilize it. Allow them to contribute to the community. Corporate social responsibility is huge for this millennial generation, partially because they grew up during a time when the issues of global warming were really upfront, and their role within the global community was very evident to them. So they want to be able to contribute to the community. So give them that opportunity, set up programs, give them some flex time so they can actually do that. And then introduce new opportunities frequently. In the U.S., we say that by the time a millennial is about 35 years old, they'll have had 4 to 5 different careers. Can you actually allow them to have those 4 or 5 different careers in your organization? Or do you expect them to be in the same job for 5 years? If you have a career development model that keeps anyone in any job for a long period of time, that model will not work for the millennials. They will leave. That is why they leave. So can you create a much more dynamic career development model? So then what do you do when you actually find yourself? So let's say you take all that to heart, what was on the last slide, to heart, but you still find yourself in the workplace and you can't stand the millennial you're working with, and there's just huge conflict, and you're like, I'm trying to be understanding, but you're driving me insane. What do you do? Well, first thing you have to do is you have to ask yourself, does the solution, does the way in which they're behaving meet business objectives? I kind of talked a little bit about this idea of preferences, traditions, and requirements. Ask yourself, is this person, in the way that they're behaving and what they're doing, meeting business objectives and meeting the requirements of the job? If they are, but the millennial is just behaving differently or doing things differently, but they are meeting the requirements, then assume that you're basing your judgment on a preference or a tradition and see if you can let that go. Is it a valid interpretation of our values? Oftentimes we see someone behaving in a certain way and saying, that violates our values. You can't be that way. We're all about teamwork, and you're not being very team-oriented when you leave at 2 a.m. in the morning, when you leave at 2 p.m. and then want to log back in at 2 a.m. But maybe teaming is more than just being in the office from 7 in the morning to 10 o'clock at night. Maybe teaming is actually getting your work done and getting it done effectively, just doing it on your own time, as opposed to doing it, in the office at the same time, all, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. at your desk. Are all affected parties engaged in the conversation or a solution being created? Now, this is a huge one. Oftentimes when we sit in an office and we said, okay, we have a problem with those millennials, we have a problem with those Gen X, what are we going to do about it? Who are the people sitting in the room? Are there any Gen X or millennials in the room? Probably not. It's probably some boomers sitting there saying, okay, why do we fix this problem? Make sure that when you're creating a solution that you have all the perspectives in that room. So even though it may feel weird, and I know that in a culture, like Korean culture, which is very hierarchical, it can feel very weird reaching down to the millennials and saying, what would you like? What solution would you like? I know that feels weird. It's very challenging, but that's really the best way to create the most optimal solution, to get all the perspectives in the room. Find common ground. It's not, we don't adhere to the fact that, you're either going to find the solution that works best for the boomers or for Gen X or for the millennials. It's about finding the common ground and actually creating a new way of working. And then segment your strategies if necessary. So your strategy, we all like to come to like one concise, clear, here's the solution, here's the strategy, we're not going to change, and that's it. But segment your strategies when necessary. You may have to be more flexible than you think you do to really create a place where everybody in every every difference in the workplace can contribute successfully. So to the issue of finding common ground, I want to just present a couple of solutions. This is not comprehensive, but just a couple of ways of finding that common ground. So here are some thoughts that that seasoned professionals will think to themselves. They'll think, you got to pay your dues. You just want to kind of make people do things. I don't want to have to explain it to you. Just do it. I gave you an assignment. Just do it. Why can't they appreciate the fact that we work so hard? We sacrifice so much to create this great nation, and we sacrifice so much to create this great organization. Why can't they appreciate that? And why can't they be here when I need them? Where are they? I need them now. Why aren't they here? And they should adhere to the rules that I set. So these are some common things that a more seasoned professional might think. So what's the converse of that for the younger generation, younger professionals? Seasoned professionals want to have you pay your dues. Younger professionals want it all. They want to be CEO tomorrow. They want to be CEO yesterday. They totally think they can be CEO. While seasoned professionals just want to make you do work and not question it, the young professionals are actually saying, what can the company do for me? Forget about what I can do for what I can do for the company. What can you do for me? Because it's really about my aspirations and my job. You want, I think every generation, we all hear it. Why can't you appreciate what you did? I grew up with the stories of, my parents told me they did this and that, and they walked up the hill both directions to go to school, so appreciate what you have. And of course, the younger generation, we just want to buck the system. We just want to, we say, yeah, we know that, but it's my time now, and I know that you did sacrifices, but, I just want to buck the system. Seasoned professionals, think, I need you there when I need you there. And the younger professionals are saying, I need freedom and flexibility for my schedule. So if I want to go to that yoga class at 4 p.m., I want to go to that yoga class at 4 p.m. And then seasoned professionals say, adhere to the rules. We have rules. The rules helped found the greatness of our nation. The rules helped found the greatness of the company. You need to adhere to them. And the young professionals are saying, you know what? I know you have rules, but I bet I can figure out to do it. I bet I can figure out a way to do it faster and better, and my ideas are going to be fresher. So then you have these two warring sets of ideas in the workplace. So what do you do? Well, you do try to find the common ground. What does that common ground actually look like? For your pay as dude, build credibility, but also create a path. So it's not about just paying dues, but it's about actually showing what that path looks like and why the path is there. It's not enough just to say, just shut up and kind of do your work and pay your dues and you'll eventually get there. It's about, this is the path and this is why the path is here. As opposed to, just making them do the work and also then conversely, what can the company do for me? Creating a learning relationship. So it's not about just telling somebody what to do, but saying, this is what you'll benefit from it. And this is what the company can actually do. If you do this job and you do it well, this is what you learn, and this is what the company does for you. The idea of appreciation versus bucking the trend. Where's the common ground there? It's about creating and focusing on a common vision. So, one thing that oftentimes, we don't try to do is we don't actually try to create a common vision between the generations, a common aspiration, and can we do that? Be at work at a certain time versus why can't I go to that yoga class at 4 p.m.? It's about creating a system that allows, an individual's mission and a company's mission to align. And it's about focusing on results. I think that's one of the biggest things that oftentimes, goes unnoticed and that's one of the biggest challenges to flexibility is we're so afraid that, someone's not going to get their work done. So that's why we need to see them at their desk. Doesn't mean the fact that someone's sitting at their desk doesn't actually mean that they're being productive. It means that they're sitting at their desk. Can we actually shift from this idea of productivity equals sitting at your desk to productivity means actually being accountable for your results? And then finally, adhering to rules versus doing it better, faster than you. Creating a common strategy, but having a flexible approach to achieving that strategy. That would be common ground. And so what we're really looking for is we're looking for mutual adaptation, both from those seasoned professionals as well as those younger professionals. And I leave a message for the millennials. I say to them, you have as much of a responsibility to get to know the seasoned professionals, the boomers and the Generation X that you work with, as much as they have to you. I know that's a hard message for some millennials, because oftentimes it's a one-way street. A lot of people say, well, the manager has to adapt to those younger workers. And I said, yes, of course. The managers have to adapt to those younger workers. But those younger workers, you're not off the hook. You have to do that as well. And then a few other things, just to kind of round out my conversation. The millennials are the very first global generation. Prior to about 30 years ago, we could not say that the baby boomers of one country were very similar to the baby boomers of another country, because there just wasn't enough of a cohesive experience to create this global commonality. But what we are seeing is that the millennials are the first global generation. They value diversity and they're very socially conscious. They're more adaptable and open to change. They're highly mobile. They've been traveling around the world because of the way in which airfares and airlines have changed over the years. They're highly mobile. They're accustomed to jumping on a plane. They seek greater flexibility and better work-life effectiveness. And notice that I don't say work-life balance. I say work-life effectiveness. It's not that they don't want to work any more than you do. They just want to work differently than you. They're heavily reliant on technology as a medium for both social and professional networking. And so I think another chief complaint that people have is oftentimes, well, the millennials really don't know when to stop putting stuff online. Well, that's because they never had to before they entered the workplace. So part of what we have to do is also educate them on that. They value and rely social networks, and they trust the opinions of their social network. They're also redefining what multitasking is. There's been actually a lot of research done on multitasking and a person's ability to multitask. And they find that the more experience you have with multitasking, the better you actually are at it. You can't ask someone who's never multitasked before to then multitask, because they literally do not have the cognitive ability and the wiring in their head to actually multitask. But if you grew up like a millennial did, multitasking, it becomes seamless and easy for you. They're globally conscious and also borderless, and they seek out brands that align with their value systems. And I think this is a huge point that a lot of people miss. The millennials are brand savvy in a way that no generation before them was brand savvy. You ask a 14-year-old or a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old about a company brand, and they'll probably tell you the right answer. And they'll probably tell you whether or not it's something that they like or not. When I was 8 years old, I didn't know the difference between Burger King and McDonald's. It's just where I got a hamburger. But an 8-year-old today knows. They're very conscious of that because they've grown up with it. So for all of you employers in this room, really focus on that employer brand. And as you globalize, also recognize that your brand is understood beyond the borders of Korea. One other final thing, this may be coming out on the screen. This is just, you can't read this slide, I recognize now, but basically this is just a highlight of the differing, when companies start thinking about diversity, it's not a consistent thing around the world. I get questions all the time. We're trying to create a global diversity and inclusion strategy. Can you help us? And I said, okay. But you do realize that diversity means different things in different countries. In the U.S., it means race, ethnicity, gender, LGBT, sexual orientation, that sort of stuff. I say in India, it's about caste. In about Korea, it's about gender. And gender and more than gender. In Western Europe, it's about immigration. In Germany, it's about the Turkish. I said, you have to understand the context within which you talk about diversity. And so this is just a little highlight of some of the trends we're seeing from a diversity perspective. And then finally, what are some of the implications more broadly of diversity to HR policies and practices? From a total rewards perspective, we're seeing rewards optimization being redefined, as well as a much more heavy focus on flexible rewards and design. From a recruitment perspective, we're seeing huge diversification of sourcing pools, as well as focus on relationships. From a talent management perspective, we're seeing global frameworks with local customization. A lot of organizations are moving towards streamlined performance management systems, but we're saying that the performance management system that may work in the US or may work in Western Europe will not work in Asia. So what kind of customization can you fit? And also we're seeing a lot more career path flexibility. A lot of this is coming from women entering into the workplace, but also the millennials. And then from a learning and development and training perspective, we're seeing multi-delivery models. So it's not enough just to training, from a training perspective, it's not enough just to have a class where there's a facilitator and then there are people sitting in a classroom. It's about using as many different delivery models as possible: e-learning, classroom, modularized, on-site, off-site, creating that creativity. So that summarizes, my focus today. We went from generational diversity, starting off just talking about generational diversity, but also then kind of expanding that a little bit to say, how do you deal with difference in the workplace? It really is about understanding yourself and understanding your behavioral norms, understanding the other, and then finding common ground from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Judy Boyoung shared a very interesting view on characteristics of diverse generations. And also, she focused on the mutual understanding and mutual adaptation. And also, how to embed it into our HR programs, which is very practical and useful to us. And also, she added how we can work with and engage millennials in our workplace. Now, Mr. Nicolas Sauvage will talk about his view on common ground and some of his real experiences in Korea at Yeouido.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed our speaker presentation about demographic and about common ground. I work in finance, and finance is very much about global, international business, where you have to find common grounds between your staff, between the countries. And my specific activity in NHCA is fund management. So fund management is to take care of savings, and our client will save for the old ages. So pension fund management, this is also all about demographics. So there is indeed a common ground, or I would say common background in many countries. You have aging population, high unemployment rate, especially for young people. You have early retirement plans. You have insufficient or unfunded retirement systems. So our mission is, how can we give confidence in the future to our young staff? And how to provide attractive long-term opportunities to these millennials, which were described by our speaker, are very short-term and opportunistic. Here, I have been in Korea for 3 years, but I only discovered recently something which was shocking for me. This is about the poverty rate among old people in all OECD countries. And Korea, among OECD, has the highest poverty rate. It means that this is a percentage of people above 65 years old which have an income which is below 50% of the national average. My home country is France. This is only 8.8%, and OECD average is 13%. Now, we hear a lot about this sandwich generation, and in the case of Korea, indeed, with such a situation, children now with the change of, the social change, they don't want or they cannot take care of their retired parents anymore, and the relatively new pension system is not developed enough to provide enough resources to old people. And in the case of France, it's the opposite. The well-established pension system is now deeply in the red, and then we need seniors to work longer until retirement, but we are not sure there will be enough jobs, offered by the labor market for this segment of the population. So I was on business trip last week in Paris, and this is how last week the millennial generation, the young people, look like. So they demonstrate about pension. They demonstrate about, what age to retire. So this is a very paradoxical situation. Now, how can we find these common grounds which were described by our speaker so well? It can be email, social network links, it can be face-to-face meetings, it can be the common roots between the people. In Korea, it's so important, the school alumni, the hometown fellows. So we need to mix all that in our workplace. And in this global business world, in an increasingly melting pot workplace, we need to create some belonging. Not only being in the office, but to create some belonging. So I would like to take the example of my company, NHCA. So this is a joint venture between Nongyop and Amundi, which belongs to Crédit Agricole Group from France. So my company is based in Yoido and has been established in 2003. So we are 60 staff. But we mix among our 60 staff a cocktail of 3 very different cultures. The Nongyop culture, which is a very strong and very unique culture in Korea, and the international culture, but also the very specific Yoido culture in the local financial industry. And I believe if we combine only 1 or 2, it is not enough. We will not be successful. So we need the 3 to fit and to work well together. So one of the big challenges for the new generation, I think, it's to overcome Babel, which means to overcome the difficulty of misunderstanding between the culture because of the language, because of the cultural difference. So personally, I love very much Chinese characters, and this one, I'm sure you will recognize, means a window. So Chinese characters, they have one meaning, one very deep meaning, but they can have many sounds, or they can be used for many words in very different languages. This is a very powerful tool. So I would like very much to propose that we need to open the window every day, and we need to search for common ground. And this is through mutual adaptation and through mutual understanding. I think this is what our speakers described so well this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicolas. Nicolas shared his own experiences at NHCA Fund Asset Management. It's very real and impressive. And the next is Miss Francie Pallan, CHO from Bill and Melinda Foundation.
Thank you. And thanks to the sponsors and organizers, but also the participants for hanging in there for the second day of this wonderful conference, and my fellow panelists as well. I have a few prepared remarks about just the next generation and some of the work that we're doing at the Gates Foundation, but then I want to transition to some of the points that were made and maybe expand on them a little bit about having this multiple generations in the workplace. So if you allow me first a few comments about what we're finding at the Gates Foundation. My role at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is to make sure that we find the talent to bring into our organization to do the critical work that we have in front of us. And so It's getting the right people, the right skills, the right time, etc. And that's something that we've all heard. But one of the areas of focus that we have is U.S. education, and we're very interested in the next generation. And some of the things that we're finding about the next generation and that we see the need for investments to be made in are around, first of all, STEM, and that's educational language for science, technology, engineering, and math. We simply don't have enough individuals in the pipeline to fill the jobs that we have in STEM fields. And they're often the most highest paid jobs as well, so it's really a challenge of why there's not more of a migration of next generation workforce moving in that direction. Just one statistic that I think is really interesting. We will graduate one PhD in science for every 18 lawyers and 50 MBAs by 2015. And so no wonder the labor shortage in the U.S. at least is not necessarily the volume of people. It's that we don't have individuals getting the education in the fields that are in the highest demand. So that's one area, focusing on STEM. The second area for next generation workforce is all about technology. And this is staggering for me, but in the United States, the adoption of technology in education lags behind the adoption of technology in every other sector in the economy. So that means education, that should be providing technology and being the leader and helping our students become technologists, that environment's lagging behind every other sector, and that's a concern. And the third area of focus for us is around post-secondary education. We believe that every child needs to have a credential or some degree, post-secondary degree, that has real meaning and value in the workplace. Just a statistic there, 2/3 of jobs available in the U.S. in the next 8 years will require more than a high school education. And so some of the trends that we're seeing are pretty disturbing as far as this next generation and how motivated they are to continue to get a certificate of some sort or some degree beyond initial or high school. So there's other things that we need to see in this next generation. I talked some about that during a session I was in yesterday. But we need individuals who are innovative, creative, motivated, and also that will apply that motivation and creativity to problem solving in the workplace. And so those are just some of the things that I wanted to share before reacting to some of the comments that were made by Bo and Nicola. So if I transition to talking about the next generation or all the generations in the workplace, I couldn't agree more on the need to find common ground. And that will be the thing that pulls us all together and help organizations and employers really meet the challenges that they have in front of them. The Gates Foundation is certainly its own melting pot. We have about 6 or 7 different sectors represented in our organization. We have people from education that are experts. We have folks from pharma, other nonprofit, for-profit, government, advocacy, and they're all kind of working there together, and we're bonded together by the compelling mission that we have that every life has equal value. So it's really the mission of our organization that pulls us together, and that's an example of finding a common ground within organizations. So Bo asked me earlier to talk about, well, gosh, if you're focused on human resources, how do you find common ground around the practices that we're responsible for in human resources in such a diverse organization like the Gates Foundation? And what I did about 2 years ago was start us on a path of going through a strategic planning process for human resources. We looked externally about what other organizations were doing. We looked internally about what our own history had been. And then we also went about finding out from a cross-section of our foundation, what did people want HR to do? It's a simple question, but you wouldn't believe the laundry list of things that employees at various levels want HR to do for them. So we had this huge laundry list. It was a little overwhelming. And what we did was we put it on a timeline. The timeline showed some things in human resources have a sequence to them. You need to put manager practices in place before you put leadership practices in place. You have to make sure that your base compensation is solid and sustainable before you'd work on things like recognition programs and so on. We're only about 12 years old, so that's why we don't have a lot of things in place, or we have many things to continue to put in place from a human resource standpoint. But what we did was we took this wish list, and HR put it on a 3-year plan, a time horizon, and then we went about sharing that 3-year plan with members of our foundation. So we'd have groups coming together, reacting to what we put together. We had leadership teams giving us advice. But together it felt like a coordinated collective activity of the whole foundation working together to establish what our human resource strategy would be. And that's how we got to common ground. So now everyone sees the wish list, but they can see what they particularly are interested in and what year that will happen and what sequence. So we were highly interactive and iterative in the process of finding common ground. The few other things that I wanted to share in just reaction to the next generation presentations, I wanted to say that it's important to understand the trade-offs that you'll make. I mean, your organizations are set up right now, and if you contemplate making some changes in your organizations to accommodate the various generations, just be thoughtful about the trade-offs that you're making. In any system, anytime you change one element of the system, there's a ripple effect on other elements of that system. And so knowing what the trade-offs are, what are the implications to the changes that you might make, and thinking about that thoughtfully. The other thing that I wanted to share is it occurred to me as Bo and Nicola were presenting, is that learning will become something that happens from everywhere and in every direction. Who learns from who? It won't be such a traditional way of learning where the seasoned professional trains the young professional. But yet there'll be this combination of learning, this wonderful combination where senior professionals are learning from young professionals and vice versa. And I think that's just fantastic. Probably long overdue as well. And the last thing is I want to make sure that we're cautious about using labels of generations. And let me expand on that just a little bit. These aren't absolutes. Bo and Nicola talked about generations, the baby boomers, the Gen X, the millennials. It's important for us to be able to categorize them so that we can understand and learn for them. But it's really important not to go back to the workplace and label individuals as Gen X, Gen Y with these attributes. We were talking yesterday as we were preparing, and even though I'm at the very edge of the baby boomer, I'm probably a Gen X wannabe, I'm at the very edge of that, but I can tell you, based on what I've done in my life, Bo calls me a millennial. So that's just an example of be cautious with the labels. They're meant for us to have general understanding, and they're not absolutes to apply to a workforce. So those were some of the comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thanks, Francie. She also shared her own efforts finding common grounds at Gates Foundation, and as a HR CHO, she did a really lot of achievement of finding building strategy and having execution of it. Before going to floor questions, I think if any of you have any questions among us, you can make it. And also, I think we have 3 questions from audiences. And if you have any questions, raise your hand, and maybe you will get microphone.
I'd like to ask a question, if I can, of the panel here. The question of fairness and around the generations is the question I'd like to ask. So, for instance, if we haven't adapted the workforce to baby boomers or Gen X, but now all of a sudden we're talking about adapting in a larger way the workforce to millennials, might there be, or what are your thoughts about Gen X and the baby boomers saying, wait a minute, why wasn't there this amount of attention given to us? And so the question of inequity or fairness from those other generations.
Thanks for that question, Francie. I think oftentimes the mistake that we make in the workplace is first to assume that fairness or equity equals sameness. So we assume that it's a one-to-one. If we give one thing to one generation, then we have to give something to another generation because that's what's fair. However, one thing that I always like to say is don't assume that a culture is inherently fair to begin with. Oftentimes, most organizations look at their culture and say, well, it's a neutral culture. And it is our belief that cultures are defined to be around one whoever created it. And for most organizational cultures, the culture of the organization tends to mimic the needs and desires of the baby boomers, because they're the ones who built the organization, they're the ones who lead it. So in some ways, there already is an inequality in the workplace that favors the baby boomers, favors the Generation X. And the millennials are the ones that are actually at a disadvantage. So if you give a Generation X or a millennial, you make an adjustment to their needs, you're not, in fact, kind of putting them up one rung above everybody else. You're actually just kind of bringing them up to where everybody else is. So it's actually, you are creating more equity and more equality by, making these adjustments in the workplace. And again, but the main thing I really want to focus on is equity and equality and fairness does not actually mean necessarily the sameness. So, and that's the challenge a lot of organizations have when they do this, is they say, well, we can't do that for one because then we have to do it for another. So just rethinking that a little bit.
I can add one thing. If you think about flexible compensation, maybe diverse generation can make their own choices to be paid by company. Millennial generation can take more of cash or another more benefits for their developing language skills like that. But the baby boomers can take their own choices of having either cash side or retirement side or other insurance side, or can take a fitness club as a benefit. So it's not a matter of equal or fairness. It can be more of choices of employees.
I actually have a question for Nicholas. When you were describing your organization and you were describing Common Ground, I just find it amazing that you were able to find a way to find common ground between so many different disparate cultures. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about what was done, what you did to create that.
Oh, it's an ongoing effort. I think if we are still well active and successful after 7 years, first maybe it's thanks to our two shareholders. We receive from them very clear and consistent messages about what is the company objective. We get from them their strong support for our business, but at the same time, I think our staff recognize that our two shareholders, they respect our company identity, our specific identity of joint venture. So we have our own identity, even if we have two powerful shareholders. So that's very important. The second point is probably the effort to have regular communication from the management about the company vision, about the company activities, the company results and objective. And then with HR, we try to promote as much as possible in this relatively small company. We are only 60 staff, some internal transfer, some internal promotion, some strong cooperation between the department. But in one of your slides, Boyoung, you had the wording learning relationship. And we try to do this effort now. I think we can do much better to have people, staff, learning from each other. So sharing experience and knowledge within the company. And then finally, I think that, yes, indeed, Nongyop and Amundi are very big companies. However, we can keep at our level in NHCA what we call the entrepreneurial spirit. So that's maybe some of the factors to keep our three cultures well together.
Thanks, Nicola. And if any of you have questions, raise your hand. And you can have your name and what you do, what company you work for.
I need to speak in Korean.
Yes. Just hold on.
예, 안녕하세요. 저는 충남대학교 CKU 모임에서 온 이대훈이라고 합니다. 제가 하고 싶은 질문은 되게 간단합니다. 그러면서도 대답하기 상당히 어려운 질문인 것 같은데요. 그게 뭐냐면 지식이 무엇인가라고 그런 질문을 드리고 싶습니다. 이 포럼에 참석해서 어제부터 세션을 몇 가지 들었는데 제프리 페퍼 교수님이랑 뭐 이렇게 여러 연사님들이 오셔가지고 하시는 말씀을 들어보니까 지식 기반 사회에 대해서 굉장히 많은 말씀을 해주셨는데요. 지금의 사회적인 현상들, 사회에서 많이 일어나는 문제들이 있는데 그 문제들은 산업시대 사회에서 있었던 그런 방식 가지고 지식시대로 이미 우리나라는 지식시대로 넘어왔는데 많은 사람들이 아직도 산업사회라고 지금 생각을 많이 하고 있습니다. 그래서 많은 사람들이 아직도 그 문제를 해결하지 못하고 있다고 생각을 하는데요. 아까 전에 피터 드러커의 그런 박사님의 말씀을 인용해서 프레젠테이션을 처음 진행하셨을 때 이런 지금에 나와 있는 그런 문제들은 이제 사람들이 해결해야 하는데 정리가 잘 안 됩니다. 그러면서 지식 근로자를 생산해내서 그러한 문제들을 해결해야 한다는 것을 책에서 읽은 적이 있습니다. 그래서 지식 근로자란 무엇이고 지식이 도대체 무엇인지 어떻게 생각하시는지 좀 알고 싶습니다.
I'll start, but I don't know if I'll actually provide you with a satisfactory answer because that is an involved question. Actually, that's something that earlier in this year I was having a conversation, or we were working with some of our clients, and the issue, I'll provide you with a related story. The issue of productivity and how you measure productivity within a knowledge-based economy came up because we were looking at like how you define what productivity is. And 50 years ago, it was very easy. It was counting widgets. It was counting products that came off an assembly line. The more products you created within the shortest period of time, that demonstrated your productivity. We don't have an equivalent, actually. You know, your question is interesting because we actually may not have the perfect definition of what a knowledge economy is because we don't know how to measure it. So by default, the way in which we measure knowledge in a lot of organizations, the way we knowledge productivity, we count productivity is by seeing how many hours a day a person can work. And that number has been increasing. And all the countries like Korea and China and Japan have been putting pressure on the Western world to work more hours because Koreans are like, chidoke. You guys just work, you know, and you work and you work and you study and you work. And so now the West looks at it and they say, oh my God, we have to do the same thing because that's the only way we can really be productive. So I think it's a question. I think your question is a good one because I don't think it's entirely answered at this point. You know, I'd love to hear from both Francie and Nicola about your definition.
I'll give it a shot as well. So knowledge for me, I mean this hasn't changed, and I don't have a dictionary in front of me. But knowledge for me is if you pick any given subject, it's what is the body of that subject, from the historical piece to the current to the prospect for the future. So knowledge around a given topic is where my next comments will come from. A knowledge worker then for me would be based on a subject and your understanding of that subject, the worker that we need is someone that knows where to go to find the more recent developments around that particular area, how to find, how to source, how to analyze that knowledge. So it's not just having an area of expertise and knowing about it, but it's how to navigate the development and the evolution that surrounds that particular body of knowledge is what I would call a knowledge worker. So just to be brief.
Indeed, the definition of knowledge can be very, very broad. So in each business, like in finance, you must have a very specific technical knowledge to perform your job. But I think it's not enough, especially in finance. There is so much information, so much noise. So to be a knowledgeable employee, I think that one of the key characteristics is to be able to digest the information. And I think one of the very important points as well is knowledge about ourselves and knowledge about the company. We always underestimate that many of our staff, they don't understand fully what is the strength of the company, what is the identity of the company. So I think we must develop this knowledge in each of our workplace.
Any other questions about the topic? Yes?
예, 한국어로 해도 괜찮겠습니까?
네.
예, 안녕하세요. 저 삼원 크리논이라고 하는 그 회사의 대표이사 하영옥입니다. 그 멜린다 게이츠님께 좀 질문 드려도 되겠죠? 저희는 그 새로운 지식을 갖고 있는 회사인데요. 근데 사실 그 지식만 갖고는 그 회사 사업화에 지금 실패를 할 수 있는 그런 위기에 있습니다. 그 지식이라는 게 지금 그 지구 온실가스를 해결하기도 하고 또 아마 제가 짐작하기로는 탄소 배출권의 그 핵심 기술인 걸로 지금 생각하는데요. 이렇게 좋은 특허를 갖고 있는 회사인데 그 게이츠님이 좀 저희 회사를 좀 이렇게 도와주실 수 있는 생각은 없으신지 그것도 궁금하고 사실 그 미국의 그 유명한 투자자 그 워런 버핏 회장님이 투자를 하신다고 지금 듣고는 있습니다만은 우리 한국 정부하고 이런 협력 문제가 아직 정리가 안 돼 있어서 해결이 안 되고 있습니다. 그 문제에 대해서 좀 말씀해 주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Sure, thank you. And I'll try to be brief given our time for the session. You know, there are many, many issues that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation can focus on. There are so many to work on. We've had to be focused on a relatively few. So our focus is on global health, the vaccine, development, delivery, agriculture in developing countries, agriculture, farmer productivity, financial services for the poor there, and then also U.S. education. So we've got 25 strategies. We don't focus, one of those strategies is not climate change, although climate change does impact things like farmer productivity and agriculture. So we do connect with partners and organizations that are knowledgeable about climate change because they connect to a strategy that we do have around agriculture. So there's a connection. It's not a core focus of ours. So I'd look forward to maybe connecting and learning a little bit more about what you're doing and how that may be a partner organization for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention. If you have any other questions, I think you can be connected later. Thank you, Francie, Nicola, and Boyoung.
Thank you.